Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to be the Winchesters Season 1, Episode 4. So, I remember in the supernatural shows, when Sam and Dean would take a whole entire season to knock off a god, John just does it in an afternoon. Just like, hey guys, I had nothing better to do. I just thought I would just take down a god today. Because, like, it's really not that difficult. Like, I don't know why it took Sam and Dean a whole season to be able to take one down. Me, like, I am, like, 4 episodes in, and I've already, like, killed, like, a god, and, like, how difficult is the Akrita gonna be? How difficult are they gonna be? Really? I'm wondering. So, I like what they did with John's story in this episode. But, like, this episodes are starting to get really repetitive. Every single episode we have John, who seems to be fighting off every monster because every monster has something to do with him. If it's not to deal with some daddy issue, mommy issue, hey, we ran out of relatives, so let's now have him deal with his war past, his military past, and tie in veterans to the story to make it seem more macho, even though this episode is to really go full Twilight. It is. It goes that direction. Full Twilight. John is shirtless in the beginning of this episode. We have to walk frickin' Carlos into a scene where I'm just like, is he gonna just grab a pole and start shaking for those dollar bills, y'all? Is that what's gonna go on in this episode? Is Carlos just gonna, you know what? Yeah. Is he gonna work the poles? Good God. This episode becomes another John and Carlos episode. Again. So, is Mary even on this show? Does she exist? Is she in credits only every single episode? Like, I don't... Oh, yeah, she has something to do in this episode. My bad. My apologies. She has the whole, like, Maggie thing going on again in this episode. Not only that, because Mary has not much else. She has no cards to play here. Mary is going on to meet up with Kyle Reed, the seemingly news reporter that Mary had met up with last episode to share a movie with. And come to find out, Reed gives Mary vital information that they didn't even frickin' need because Mary, John, and Ladia and Carlos go to the hospital anyways to look at the body. That didn't feel like a waste of time whatsoever in this frickin' episode. So, we have nothing for Mary here. Like, we have to admit that. This is the John and Carlos show. It really is. I need to adjust the poster of this. I really, like, if somebody has, like, a Photoshopped thing of John and Carlos together, and it works, I will put this on here. I will. So, Photoshop it out. Figure out a way. Do something. So, we go on into this episode, and we deal with, instead of monsters, demons, and things that go bump in the night, we're dealing with emotional demons. We're dealing with eternal things. And we are also going on and reopening wounds to finally get closure and resolve all of them. Not quite sure about that whole ghost thing that is following around John, but we'll figure it out. So, with that said, for this episode is bad, but you know what? Like, it could be worse. It really just could be worse. So, with that said, let's go on into the double five time territory. I think it's about that time yet again to, of course, go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about the time to spoil this episode. In the beginning of it, we, of course, have Hannibal Park Hospital, St. John's, Missouri. We have a guy named Patches who is going into this therapy session, and Pat, excuse me, Patches is to storm off to go on and find a god in front of him. They end up stating that this guy is to be the god of war, or Mars, or NATO, because we've already had, like, Ares here, so they have to go with a different god of war, right? So, we have the god of war that appears and kills off Patches, and so now we go into Lawrence, Kansas. This is still the 70s, just so everybody knows. It's just so everyone's aware. So, we have both John and Mary who are sparring. And so John is trying to punch shirtless against Mary's hands because she has padding on them. And so Mary's starting to realize that John really needs somebody to, like, fight back. Besides just him, like, punching a punching bag, basically. That would be the equivalent. So Mary starts to go on and fight with John, and she ends up, like, armbarring him pretty easily, which is like a submission. And John ends up going down. Carlos ends up going on to be like, hey, like, what are you guys doing out here? Because that's my man. That's my guy. That's mine. It's mine, Mary. Me and him together are gonna go through some stuff in this episode. Mary's like, no. That's not what it said, but it honestly should be. So, we then have John and Mary realize that Carlos has some very important things to tell to these people. So, Mary and John walk in, and so we have Ladia, and Carlos is like, well, should I start or should you start? I don't know. Should I start? Could we milk this out? Could we, like, be more confused about who should really just stay their lines? So Carlos goes first, and Carlos is to state that he had went to this this bowling alley with a bunch of veterans, and Carlos is to state that he knew about a guy named Patches who died in a very unusual way. They they are to roll it off as a self-death. But Carlos is like, no, I think it's something else. So we have John who's saying to Carlos, like, wow, like, I didn't know that you hung out with the veterans. Like, I didn't know that you, like, were in that kind of crowd. And Carlos is like, yeah. So we go on to have Latia. Man, what amazing performance she gives in this episode, right? Just hands down the best acting in 2022. She deserves an Oscar. But hey, she'll get a paycheck all the same. Some people are gonna need, like, if they haven't had much acting experience, they'll become more comfortable with what they're doing. I'm bashing somebody now, but maybe that'll motivate a person later to become a better actor. And plus also, there's a lot of people that are to state that there is always an uphill climb to understand acting. Like, you can't just do it right away. So, anyways, we go on to have Latia that is to naturally assume that it could be a manticore, a Persian manticore, or it could be a dragon that there might be dealing with. Yeah, because I want a dragon to show up, because when the dragon showed up before in Supernatural, man, was that lit, right? Man, like, that dragon in Supernatural was sweet. Like, we just had a guy that showed up in black eyes, and that was a dragon. It's true. There is no CGI in Supernatural. There really wasn't. So, we go into this episode, and since both John and Carlos are the only ones with military experience, we have Mary that's like, okay, like, we need to have you guys go on and meet up with Dr. Zappano. And you guys need to go and have some really good war stories, so that way, like, you guys can make it into this group, because obviously Patches was to possibly die from being in this therapy session, so maybe that's the connection. So John and Carlos go on to this facility, and so Carlos is talking to this doctor after kind of strutting his stuff while he's walking out in his Navy uniform, and having John talk to Millie about, like, well, yeah, like John is gonna go on and excuse me, and kind of talk about his past. So we push on to have John and Carlos ends up pulling this nurse aside, because it seems that therapy session was all full. And so Carlos ends up talking to the nurse, is like, well, here's the thing. Like, I think John here is going to need all the help that he possibly can. And, like, you need to give us, like, the best doctor. And what we heard around here is, like, and that doctor is it. So the girl's like, okay, like, all right, like, I'll let you guys go in there. So the doctor ends up seeing both John and Carlos, and so it seems, instead of just having these people just kind of just sit around and do nothing and say nothing, immediately we have the good doctor that goes on to ask anybody, like, hey, would you like to share? Carlos is like, yes, I so do. Yes, over here. Me, over here. So Carlos ends up sharing, and so come to find out, Carlos is to have me confused of whether he was in the Navy or in anywhere. And so Carlos has this story about him going on in the fields. Because what kind of Navy was he in? Was he in the Air Force? Usually Navy people are in, like, submarines, but maybe, like, we had Carlos who, like, he was to have this kind of other position. Like, maybe, I don't know. What do I know about the Navy? I've heard about things. I've known stuff. So I wouldn't recommend it, but I've heard things. So Carlos is is to go on and mention that he had gone on and seen all these lights, like as if they were Christmas tree lights. Then come to find out, he ended up going on. Maybe it was a U.S. Marine or a naval Marine. I don't know. Like, I'm trying to figure out, like, where could have Carlos been in action when he was a naval officer? I'm trying to figure it out. So Carlos goes on to talk about these lights as if they're Christmas tree lights, but it ends up being the enemy. What a great story. I could care less. And then so John goes on, and he is to now have to like unload his story. And Carlos is to get so emotional that he has to take a whiz. I have to go on and just like I have to really go and clean myself up from all the tears that you cried. Sure. Anyways, so John is to now tell his story that we've already heard about from pilot episode. So John ends up stating that he, of course, was to have his friend go on to have him step on a mine, and then he died. So it's the doctor's like, well, like that's something rough you're going through there. All right, like okay, like at least you just talked. Like that was good. So there is no like this therapist is just like coming up with some kind of like answer or some kind of something. No, like it's just like, oh, good for you that you shared. So we of course have Jimmy Mixon, who had talked to John before he got in here, and Jimmy is telling John, it's like, yeah, nobody really listens to you here. Like nobody really goes on and really cares. But hey, at least the donuts are good, right? So Jimmy ends up talking to the therapist that he's not really listening, and Jimmy storms off. Come to find out, they find Jimmy dead as John is to follow Jimmy to try and talk to him, and all of a sudden there's blood on this door. John opens it, Jimmy's dead. So we also go on to have Mary, who goes to speak with Kyle Reed, and Kyle Reed is to mention how Patches' wounds were to be very unusual, that a self-death doesn't quite make sense when there were burn marks on Patches. It doesn't quite make sense. So when Mary, John, and Carlos all break in to this hospital, we have a nurse that is going on and stopping them and like, well, hey, like we can't take any more like patients. And they're like, well, like I'm sorry, but we just transferred from like the Buchanan hospital, and like we're gonna have to send this here. And so the nurse is just like, well, okay, just go along. So we have our doctors who make their way into the morgue, and they look into Patches' body, and yeah, he has unusual wounds, but he also has this wedding ring as well as this necklace off to the side. So we go on to have Patches' wife show up, wanting to collect this doctor or this Patches, his effects, like his wedding ring and his necklace. John was holding on to this necklace because it was the same necklace that his partner wore, and so John is giving this necklace to this woman. It's like, oh, like, thank you for your service. Like, like, thank you for like Patches going on and so on and so forth. So we go on to find out as we have John walk away, Kyle is to have been the one who had talked to Patches' wife. And so Mary goes on and seeks him out and is to find the exact same amount of information that Mary already knows. So it's basically like the same kind of story here. So Mary is to make up this story to Kyle that she has had a death in the family and like the wound is too fresh, and so her and Kyle can't be an item because Mary is kind of dealing with that loss. Kyle is like, okay, I understand. So we have John that is banging away in this bathroom. He's punching this thing in the bathroom, and we all of a sudden have the god who just appears and then disappears as John is to look back. So we continue to have John and Carlos, who keeps going to these therapy sessions, and eventually this leads us to finally have a fight between both John and NATO. So how that leads is to having John and Carlos try to go throughout this hospital, and they all of a sudden wind up in the forest, into this jungle. Carlos, it seems, had stepped on this mine, and so John is just like, well, like, I guess you're just stuck there. And then all of a sudden, the God of War, NATO, appears and is talking to John and is stating, like, well, hey, like, if you can beat me, then I'll let you and your friend free. But, like, if the opposite happens, like, I'm going to have you be, like, my apprentice, because this is all to strengthen John up to have him fight the Akrita. And so there's an Akrita tie to the God of War. So John goes on to fight the God of War, and Mary is dealing with her having problems with Maggie's room. They look through the room, they realize that I guess Maggie was a big Donny Osmond fan, and so on and so forth. So we have the girls starting to figure out that maybe after all, if it's not the Manticore, and if it's not the dragon, what else could this be? So Ladia looks further into it and is to find out that maybe this is the God of War. NATO, Mars NATO. So they come to this conclusion and they're like, well, how can we go on and defeat this thing? And they're like, well, if we go on and we capture the totem that this god has, like, we can defeat him that way. So come to find out, this is like a ghost all over again. So we have Mary and we have Ladia that run off to find Jimmy's room and are to kind of comb through it. Come to find out, in a ceiling tile, there was to be the totem there, and so both Mary and Ladia grab it, and so then that leads to have John, who can kind of go after, kill, and kind of beat to death this god. As we have a moment where John is to take this guy's own spear, break it in half, and then stab him with it. I'm like, you know what? There's a sharp end to that spear that you could have easily just stabbed into that guy. But no, like, let's just break off the spear, stab that into him, because also, here's the kicker. So, this Roman, like, man, this gladiator, is wearing armor. But that spear can just easily pierce through this guy's stomach like nobody's business. So, this wooden spear just right through the chest. So, we have Jimmy that states to John that, like, you are prepared to fight the Akrita. whenever you're going to go on and do that will probably be the next episode. You just wipe them out, right? With one thought. Because you've already beaten a god. Like, is the next week's episode going to be, like, the Winchester Scooby Gang versus the Akrita, and they just wipe them out? And it's like, well, like, we've already gone and done our season threat here. So, I guess we're, like, done and over with this show. So, that'll be great, right? So, we... After this, we go on to also have John and Carlos. Or no. We had Mary, Millie, and we also had Ladia that were coming to this doctor and wanted to know exactly where John and Carlos were. And the doctor is coming up with some excuse of like, well, like, you can't see certain psych ward patients. And Millie's just like, well, he's my son, so, like, I'm going to see him whether you want me to or not. And so, come to find out, the doctor ends up finding out from this nurse that the body of Jimmy is to have disappeared. So, the doctor is just like, well, since I have to deal with that, like, you guys can feel free to do whatever the heck you want. So, Millie, Mary, and Ladia find where John and Carlos are. And so by the end of this, we have the doctor that is to tell both Carlos and John that the next time around, they're not going to go and treat veterans that way, that they treated Patches or Jimmy. And this doctor is kind of hoping that Carlos will come back. And Carlos is like, yeah, I think I found myself a doctor. So we have the doctor that ends up kind of walking off. And so we seem to have everybody who has kind of worked through what they need to work through. And Mary ends up telling Carlos that she may actually have room for him if he wants to just kind of stay with them. Because Carlos is to state that he is so afraid he's going to have nightmares that he's going to not be able to sleep in his van tonight. And so Mary's like, well, how about you sleep in Mary's... in Maggie's old room? And Carlos is like, really? Like, you'd let me do that? And Mary's like, yeah, because you're going to be a season regular, right? You're not going to get killed off anytime soon. Sure? Like, you're going to have to be a part of the Scooby Gang, whether people want it to happen or not, right? Yay! So, you're going to be in every episode. So, we go on and have Carlos and John, who have this moment where Carlos turns to John and is like, well, hey, like, if you ever need to talk, John, like, I'll be here. And John is like, yeah, all right, okay. So, come to find out, we have John, who goes home, and Millie hears the shower running. And so, Millie is to find out that John is just in the shower, and he's just sitting there with all of his clothes on, and he's going through some stuff. So Millie goes on in there and comforts John, and that's how the episode ends. And I'm like, wow, what a goofy way to wrap up this episode. But yeah, so with that said, let me know in the comments below how you felt about this episode. I tried to quickly get through this episode to get it finished and get it over with. Let me know if there's anything that I... Excuse me. Let me know if there's anything that I forgot about, because I'm sure that there probably is, because I'm under the weather, as you can tell. Like, I am sorry if at any point I was to cough, or sneeze, or snort, or whatever. But yeah, but I needed to do this review. Like, really, if I could have gone on and not done this review or edited myself out at any point or whatever, I would have. But anyways, so with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Let me know in the comments below how you felt about this episode, whether you liked it, whether you hated it, whether you took a real just meh about it. If the following episode is to not blow my socks off, just really blow them off, I think that I'm going to go on and just, like, call it a wrap. I don't know. Like, I just feel this show is not where I want it to be. And it'll never get there. We also had Ladia that was to state that all the men of letters were all these, like, white guys. So Abaddon, the girl that was Abaddon, that was a white dude, right? The girl that was attached to the men of letters in the past, that was a white guy, right? Only old white dudes are to be the men of letters, right? And obviously, you could really compare that to the writing staff, especially in this episode, right? Like, they're all just a bunch of white dudes that have all written this episode where John is shirtless and Carlos is dancing on a pole. Oh, I'm sorry, he was just kind of strutting his stuff in his naval attire. Where we go on and have Millie. Let's state this now, since it's the end of the review. Millie goes on and states that it's like, well, yeah, like, women like a man in a uniform. And Carlos is like, yeah, so do men. And so it's like, so, in other words, is that your target audience that you're trying to go with the show? You've given up on trying to get every single demographic? So you're appealing only to a minimum audience rather than everybody? Is that where this show has already given up? Wow. So this show is not even bothering to try to appeal to a family audience. It's just appealing to a certain number of people to just clutch on and hang on and just, yeah, like, we're only going to get these certain people and that's it. That's all we're caring about. Because somehow this show will get renewed for a second season, right? Anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.